Ladies and gentlemen, we often imagine demonic influence as something grotesque, horned creatures lurking in the shadows, whispering dark commands. But the work of the enemy is far subtler, far more ordinary, and therefore far more dangerous. Evil seldom announces itself with a trumpet blast. It seeps, it corrodes, it whispers with the voice of our own desires. If you have begun to notice something different in your spouse, not merely a bad mood, but a steady and unsettling change, you must consider the possibility that something unseen is at work. Let us be clear, not every quarrel or coldness is the work of devils. We are fallen creatures, perfectly capable of ruining our own happiness. But there are times when the fingerprints of a darker hand are unmistakable. There is a peculiar transformation that occurs when darkness begins its slow, insidious work upon the soul. It does not begin with some grand declaration of evil, but rather with a subtle shifting of affections. A person who once found joy in goodness, who admired honesty, gentleness, and faith, begins to feel an unspoken irritation toward these very things. It is not a dramatic hatred, at least not at first, but a quiet, creeping disdain. What was once inspiring now appears tiresome. What was once noble is now dismissed as foolish. This change often manifests in casual scoffing. A husband who once valued integrity might now speak cynically of those who practice it, as if honesty is a game played by the weak. A wife who once cherished faith may now roll her eyes at prayer, or speak of religious devotion as something outdated, childish, or unnecessary. There is no reasoned rejection of the good, no intellectual debate, only a vague and growing resentment. Virtue, once attractive, now seems irritating. It is an inversion of perception. The man who once admired kindness now sees it as weakness. The woman who once valued patience now calls it passivity. The things that make a soul strong, humility, gratitude, self-control, are now regarded as limitations, as if the truly free person is one who throws off such burdens. A slow hostility replaces former admiration, and this hostility is often expressed through mockery. The good is not attacked directly, but is instead belittled, made to seem small, naive, or irrelevant. This contempt, once rooted, begins to spread. It does not remain contained within the mind of the afflicted, but seeps into their interactions. When they encounter genuine goodness in others, they do not rejoice in it, but feel provoked by it. The sight of sincerity makes them uncomfortable. The presence of holiness unsettles them, not because these things are false, but precisely because they are true. And truth, once despised, becomes unbearable to those who have rejected it. At this stage, the afflicted person often begins to seek out new companions, not necessarily because they prefer their company, but because they need an environment where their contempt for goodness will be affirmed rather than challenged. They avoid old friends whose very presence reminds them of what they once loved. They draw close instead to those who share their cynicism, those who will reinforce their shifting perspective. It is a dreadful thing to watch, for it is not merely a change of mind, but a corruption of heart. What makes this condition so dangerous is that it masquerades as liberation. The person does not believe they are descending. They believe they are awakening. They imagine they are shedding illusions and embracing a deeper wisdom. They will even pity those who still believe in goodness, as if such belief is the mark of an unenlightened soul, and so they drift further, convinced all the while that they are walking toward the light, never realizing that what they mistake for dawn is only the glow of distant flames. There is a strange delight that takes root in the heart when a person begins to prefer discord over peace. It does not appear all at once, nor does it make itself known in obvious ways. At first, it is just a small satisfaction in being right, in winning an argument, in feeling superior to another. But in time this pleasure grows, and soon the person is no longer content with occasional disputes. They seek them. They look for offense where none was intended, twist innocent words into weapons, and turn every disagreement into a battlefield. This transformation is often unnoticed at first, even by the one undergoing it. They believe they are simply standing up for themselves, defending their opinions, or refusing to be taken advantage of. They do not see that they have begun to cultivate a taste for strife. Conflict no longer troubles them, as it once did. In fact, it energizes them. They walk away from arguments not weary but invigorated. And so, without realizing it, they begin to provoke division where none is necessary. Once this taste for discord has taken hold, peace begins to feel unnatural. When things are calm, the afflicted person feels restless, dissatisfied, as if something is missing. Harmony, which once brought comfort, now feels stifling, even dull. They may not recognize it, but they have developed an appetite for the sharpness of conflict, the rush of anger, the satisfaction of seeing someone else flustered, wounded, or made to yield. It is no longer about the content of the argument, it is about the thrill of battle itself. What makes this condition so insidious is that it often disguises itself as passion, conviction, or even justice. The person believes they are merely fighting for what is right, for truth, for fairness. They tell themselves that their anger is righteous, that their refusal to back down is strength. They do not see that they have come to value contention for its own sake, that their heart is no longer drawn to what is true, but to the intoxicating experience of conflict itself. This love for division does not remain confined to arguments with strangers or enemies. It seeps into the most sacred relationships. The afflicted person begins to find fault with those closest to them, their spouse, their family, their friends. Small irritations that once passed unnoticed now become reasons for confrontation. They push away those who love them, not because they truly wish to be alone, but because they cannot resist the impulse to provoke. If someone attempts to make peace, they scoff at the effort, seeing it as weakness or as an attempt to control them. Beneath all of this there is a terrible loneliness, for no matter how often they engage in conflict, no matter how many arguments they win, they find that satisfaction is fleeting. The thrill fades quickly, leaving behind only exhaustion, isolation, and a hunger for the next fight. But instead of recognizing this hunger as a sickness of the soul, they convince themselves that it is proof of their strength. And so they continue, ever thirsting, ever striving, ever pushing away those who would offer them something far greater than victory, something they have long forgotten how to receive. There is a quiet and terrible shift that happens when guilt begins to lose its voice. At first it is merely ignored, a fleeting discomfort that is quickly reasoned away. A person makes an excuse, justifies an action, dismisses a wrongdoing as unimportant, but over time something deeper takes place. The conscience, once a sharp and living thing, begins to dull. What once brought remorse now barely stirs a reaction. The voice that once whispered warnings grows fainter, until at last it falls silent altogether. This numbness to guilt is not an accident, nor is it an unavoidable consequence of wrongdoing. It is something that must be cultivated, chosen, reinforced with every decision. The first lie requires effort, the second is easier, the third hardly requires a thought. A selfish act at first brings discomfort, but repeat it often enough and it becomes second nature. The person does not wake up one morning devoid of conscience. It is a slow, deliberate deadening, as if the soul has been wrapped in layer upon layer of callousness, until it can no longer feel. The absence of guilt does not mean the absence of sin. It merely means that sin no longer feels like a burden. The person may even mistake this numbness for freedom, believing that they have finally shaken off the unnecessary weight of guilt and shame. They laugh at what once troubled them, dismiss the standards they once held, and pity those who still struggle under the old constraints of conscience. What they do not see, what they refuse to see, is that their loss of guilt is not a sign of growth, but of decay. This change often reveals itself in the way a person responds to correction. Where once they might have felt sorrow at being called out, now they react with indifference, or worse, with hostility. If a spouse points out a wrongdoing, they scoff or turn the blame back upon the accuser. If a friend offers gentle rebuke, they dismiss it as judgmental or unnecessary. The very idea of admitting fault becomes distasteful, even offensive. They do not repent because they no longer believe there is anything to repent of. This numbness affects not just their actions, but their entire perception of the world. What once seemed black and white now appears grey. What was once clearly wrong is now complicated. They convince themselves that morality is flexible, that guilt is nothing more than a relic of an outdated system designed to control people. They believe they have outgrown the need for it, and yet beneath it all there lingers an unease, too deep to be acknowledged, too subtle to be named. For no matter how much they suppress their conscience, the truth does not disappear. It waits in the silence, in the stillness, in the rare and quiet moments when distraction fails them. And though they may run from it for years, there will come a day when it catches up with them, when, at last, they are forced to feel again. The descent into deception does not begin with grand falsehoods, but with small, seemingly harmless distortions. A slight exaggeration here, a convenient omission there. Just enough to shape reality in a more comfortable way. At first, these are not even recognized as lies. They are simply ways to avoid trouble, to smooth over an awkward situation, to make oneself appear better in the eyes of others. But as these small untruths become easier, they grow bolder. What was once an occasional indulgence becomes a habit, and before long, the person finds that lying is no longer a tool, it is a way of life. The love for lies is not simply about deception itself, but about the power it grants. To twist reality according to one's own desires is intoxicating. With a few words, a person can avoid blame, shift responsibility, or manipulate another's perception. Lies become shields against consequences, weapons against those who stand in the way, and instruments of control. The lie begins to believe they are not bound by truth, but are instead the masters of it. If reality is inconvenient, they simply rewrite it. With each falsehood, their attachment to truth weakens, facts become fluid, promises become meaningless, and integrity becomes a distant memory. They may even convince themselves that their lies are not lies at all, merely adjustments to the truth, necessary for a greater purpose. They justify their deceit by claiming it prevents harm, maintains peace, or avoids unnecessary conflict, but deep down they know otherwise. They know that lying is not merely about avoiding trouble, it is about avoiding accountability. Over time, the person no longer lies only when necessary but seeks opportunities to do so. They take a strange satisfaction in misleading others, in knowing something that others do not, in weaving falsehoods so skillfully that even they begin to believe them. Honesty starts to feel unnatural, even dangerous. Telling the truth exposes them to vulnerability, forces them to face reality as it is, rather than as they wish it to be. And so, they resist truth, reject it, despise it. The more they rely on deception, the more isolated they become. Every lie requires another to sustain it, and soon their entire life is built upon fragile foundations. They must always remember what they said, whom they deceived, what version of reality they presented. They begin to distrust others, assuming that everyone else is just as dishonest as they are. Genuine relationships become impossible, for connection requires honesty, and honesty has become intolerable. Despite all their efforts to control the narrative, they find themselves trapped within their own web. Lies, once a source of power, become a prison. They must keep up the act, maintain the illusion, suppress the fear that one day the truth will surface. And in the rare moments when they are alone with their thoughts, when there is no one left to deceive, they are left with the one thing they can never escape: the reality of what they have become. Despair does not always announce itself with weeping or visible sorrow. Sometimes it is hidden beneath a carefully crafted exterior, concealed behind laughter, confidence, or even defiance. A person suffering from hidden despair does not always appear broken. In fact, they may seem more determined than ever to enjoy life. They seek out distractions, new pleasures, new ambitions, as if the next thrill, the next success, the next indulgence will finally silence the gnawing emptiness within. But no matter how much they consume, no matter how far they run, the void remains. This despair is not merely sadness, it is a fundamental restlessness of the soul. There is an underlying dissatisfaction that lingers beneath every achievement, a hollowness that no amount of pleasure can fill. They may chase after entertainment, wealth, or even relationships, always moving, always searching, never content. For a time these pursuits may offer relief, but it is always fleeting. The moment the distraction fades, they are left alone with themselves, and the emptiness returns stronger than before. What makes this despair so dangerous is that it is often denied. The afflicted person refuses to acknowledge it, convincing themselves that if they just keep going, keep chasing, they will eventually find what they are looking for. They mistake movement for progress, indulgence for fulfillment, pleasure for joy, but deep down they know that something is wrong. They know that no matter how much they attain, their thirst is never quenched. There is an aching sense that they have lost something, though they may not be able to name what it is. In many cases, they try to bury this despair beneath cynicism or mockery. They laugh at those who speak of deeper meaning, scoff at the idea of peace, dismiss love and faith as sentimental illusions. If they can convince themselves that nothing truly satisfies, then perhaps they do not have to face the terrible truth, that they were made for something greater than what they have chosen. And so they keep running, keep filling their days with noise, keep numbing themselves with whatever distractions are available. But despair, no matter how deeply hidden, always finds a way to surface. It creeps in during quiet moments, in the dead of night, in the spaces between distractions. It manifests in irritability, in bursts of anger, in sudden waves of exhaustion. It weighs down the soul, making even the simplest joys feel empty, turning even victories into meaningless achievements. And yet, instead of turning back, instead of seeking what they have lost, they double down on the path they have chosen, fearing that to stop, to reflect, to admit their despair would be too unbearable. There is no prison stronger than the one built by the refusal to face the truth. The person trapped in hidden despair may surround themselves with friends, with pleasures, with accomplishments, but they remain profoundly alone. And the longer they deny their emptiness, the deeper it grows, until they can no longer remember what it felt like to be whole. The solution is not found in striving, nor in accumulating more of what has already failed to satisfy. It is not hidden in some distant philosophy or unlocked by sheer force of will. It does not come through distraction, nor through further descent into darkness. The solution is, and always has been, a return to what was abandoned, a rediscovery of what was cast aside, a surrender to the truth that was long resisted. It begins with the quiet and often painful realization that the path taken has led nowhere. All the justifications, all the attempts to redefine right and wrong, all the efforts to silence the conscience have produced only exhaustion and emptiness. There is no use in denying it any longer. The soul was never meant to thrive on deception, division, and selfishness. It was never designed for cynicism and contempt. The hollow ache that lingers beneath every indulgence is not an illusion. It is the soul's cry for what it was made to know. This realization alone is not enough. Awareness of one's lostness does not bring one home. There must be a choice, a turning, a willingness to lay down pride and acknowledge the need for something greater. The darkness that once seemed so liberating must now be recognized for what it truly is, a prison. But the most insidious trick of this prison is the illusion that there is no way out, that the damage is too great, that the path back is too far. This is the final lie that must be rejected. The way back is not complicated, though it is difficult. It requires humility, the willingness to admit error, the courage to face what has been avoided for so long. It demands honesty, a breaking of the habit of falsehood, a refusal to continue living in self-deception. It calls for a renunciation of the things that once seemed so precious: pride, control, the need to always be right. None of these things have brought peace, and they never will. There is something profoundly terrifying about this moment of surrender, for it requires trust in what is unseen. It is easier to remain in the familiar misery than to risk the vulnerability of change. And yet, those who take even the smallest step in the right direction find that they are not alone. The darkness does not have the final word. There is mercy for those who seek it, restoration for those who desire it, and freedom for those who are willing to walk away from their chains. What was lost can be found. What was broken can be healed. What seemed beyond repair can be made whole again. But only if one is willing to stop running, stop resisting, and finally turn toward the light. The solution has always been within reach, not in further striving, but in surrender, not in strength, but in weakness, not in more of the same, but in the courage to embrace what was once rejected. And in the end, this is not the loss of self, but the beginning of truly being alive.